Hi, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron. What do you want to talk about today?
How much I hate diets.
Yeah, diets suck.
So what do you do instead of a diet?
Intuitive eating. Health at every size.
So how many times have you had to explain intuitive eating and health at every size to someone?
Like 5,000 times. But that was just to my doctor.
Okay, so how many times have you explained it to someone and then they said, but diets are the only thing I know?
That's like every time. Can we pursue health without thinking about weight?
Yes, we can pursue health without thinking about weight.
That's pretty revolutionary, what you just said. But what if you just don't like yourself at the size that you're at?
I think we need to understand why, instead of just saying I need to change.
So, what's the deal with body positivity?
Oh man, that's a long answer. I'm Aaron Flores.
And I'm Glenys Oyston. And we are Dietitians Unplugged.
Hey, Glenys.
Hey, Aaron.
Welcome back, everybody, for another episode of Dietitians Unplugged. We're really happy to have you here with us. How are things going, Glenys?
Pretty good. How are
Awesome.
things going for you?
Awesome. I'm looking forward to this episode. This is like, I sort of didn't sleep last night because I was excited about this one.
Oh, wow. Well, I am too, because I realized like in our 3 years that we've been doing this, we have not really done an episode on binge eating disorder, which is, well, our bad. But, I think we've been waiting to get the right people on to talk about it. So but binge eating disorder is one of my favorite things to talk about.
Well, listen, if we've been waiting, we hit a friggin' home run because we have two amazing experts on binge eating disorder on our podcast today. So we have Chevese Turner and Amy Pershing, who are on the show today, who just released a book called Binge Eating Disorder, The Journey to Recovery and Beyond. And this book is a must-have for any clinician working with binge eating disorder or for any individual who is struggling with binge eating disorder. It's a really amazing book and probably comes to sort of the top of the heap of list of books that people should be reading if they want to learn more about this.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I just in the first few pages alone, I learned more than like I have in many years. I think just like new things that I was actually able to use in my practice too, that really helped inform me and I think was really useful in helping light bulbs to go on for some of my clients. So this is the book to read on binge eating disorder right now. So I'm super excited
amazing
that they're with us. Yeah. Yeah.
So we are we did our best to try and keep it to a 45 to hour long podcast. We probably could have talked for hours on this one because there's just so much information. But let's just read the bios here, and so you know who's on the show, and give you a little bit more information. So Chevese Turner, she is the founder and former CEO of the Binge Eating Disorder Association, BEDA, which is recently merged with the National Eating Disorder Association. Chevese has extensive experience in the eating disorder community as an advocate for those with binge eating disorder and all high-weight eating disorders, and is passionate about changing the conversation around weight and body size. She wants to change the current dominant weight-focused paradigm to one that is inclusive and promotes well-being, free from weight stigma and body discrimination. And she carries these messages to audiences around the U.S. and abroad in schools, healthcare settings, trade organizations, professional conferences, corporations, and governmental agencies. Chevese is also the co-author of the recently published, which we will be discussing today, Binge Eating Disorder, The Journey to Recovery and Beyond, and contributes regularly to podcasts and the media.
And Amy Pershing is a licensed master social worker and part of the Academy of Certified Social Workers. And she's the founder of BodyWise BED treatment program and the clinical director of the Center for Eating Disorders in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Based on 30 years of clinical experience, Amy has pioneered a treatment approach for BED that is strengths-based, incorporating internal family systems and somatic trauma techniques. Her approach also integrates attuned eating and movement and a health at every size philosophy. She's been widely featured in media speaking about BED treatment and recovery, relapse prevention, weight stigma, and attuned eating and movement. She's the winner of BEDA's 2016 Pioneer and Clinical Advocacy Award and is also the co-author of the book Binge Eating Disorder, The Journey to Recovery and Beyond. Amy maintains her clinical practice treating BED in Ann Arbor. And we're so grateful that they could take time out of their schedule to be here today.
Absolutely. Like I said, this is, one that these two folks are just really quite inspiring in my work. And so to have them on the show is really quite a moment for me. And I know for you too, Glenys.
Yeah. And so let's not wait any longer. Let's get to the episode. I think you guys will all enjoy it.
Enjoy. Well, I am super excited to welcome Chevese Turner and Amy Pershing to the podcast. Chevese and Amy, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join us today.
Thank you, Aaron and Glenys.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, of course. So, like I said in the intro that we recorded, I sort of didn't sleep last night because I was really excited to talk to you and also super nervous. So again, this just means a lot to us, and I know that a lot of the work that you've done, especially writing this book, is going to be really helpful to the community. So, I got a chance to read the book over the past week, and I think my highlighter ran out of ink a couple times because there were so many things that I bookmarked and wanted to highlight. But it's a really unique format for a book like this. So can you give us sort of your origin story of how you all two decided to collaborate and write this book?
I think one of the things that I knew from working with Chevese, I'd heard her present parts of her story in different talks and presentations that we'd done together. And her story is so compelling, for one thing, but it also, I think, just sort of speaks to so many of the common issues with binge eating disorder that I knew I wanted to ultimately talk about as a clinician. And so being able to to put together Chevese's story and the things that feel most important to me that folks with BED or folks treating BED know, the synergy was just perfect.
And from my perspective, as I had gone through my journey with BED, it really was when I met Amy and other folks in the Hayes community that the final pieces of my recovery journey began to come together. And Amy, although I've never had a clinical relationship with her, was very instrumental in helping me get to those final pieces of recovery. So there was no doubt in my mind that she was the person that I wanted to take clinical care of my story.
It's almost like an Avengers movie for me. Like it's like two like superheroes coming together and like teaming up in the way that you really want them to team up. One of the things as I was reading is like that I really enjoyed is this mix of like personal narrative and then clinical background and data to support and talk about effective ways of treatment. For Chevese, like how do you feel like narratives are important in as we talk about treating binge eating disorder? What is the importance of those narratives?
I think it's so important for the person that is sharing the narrative and for the people who are receiving the narrative, because there is this connection that happens. The very beginning stages, what I wanted so much was connection, and ultimately that led to my founding the Binge Eating Disorder Association. And through that work, I was able to find so many more connections for myself and for others. So, by sharing my narrative, it allowed other people to really see themselves and think, I'm not alone in this. There are other people, because I think for myself, definitely, and from what I've heard from the BED community, is that so many of us thought that we were totally alone, that something was so profoundly wrong with us, that we were the only one out there experiencing these things. And so I really believe the connection that narratives brings is the key.
Amy, can you sort of address that part also? Like as a clinician, what important part for you do narratives bring to this work?
For so many folks who struggle with BED, truth telling was not okay. in so many different ways. There are significant portion of folks with binge eating disorder have complex trauma, have trauma in their histories. And so one of the things that was often true is they had to keep their world, their reality to themselves, their feelings, their needs, their ideas. And then when they go out into a culture, particularly in a bigger body, that tells them their body isn't okay either, we sort of get this ongoing reinforcement that it's not okay to be who you are in the world. So telling the narrative in and of itself is healing. So I think there's that piece. And just to echo what Chevese said, I know that was my experience with binge eating disorder as well. I'm also recovered. And I think it felt very much to me always like I was just failing my diet. I just didn't have willpower. I just didn't have the ability to keep going like apparently everyone else did.
Yeah.
So I think speaking that out loud, again, takes some of the shame away, and it allows us to be curious about our experience and others instead of judgmental.
Yeah, it's such an important piece for sure. And, I think the thing I would add too is like, as clinicians, like being able to listen, especially, to these narratives instead of, I don't know, I think as dietitians, we're taught a lot to fix it really quick, and being able to sit with just listening and not having to come in with a fix-it hat is something that resonates also with this story.
I very much agree with that, Erin. I think a lot of a lot of the target in binge eating disorder treatment is the relationship with food, is the binge eating itself. So there's that fix-it kind of energy and not really looking enough, I found, at the role binging plays.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think this is not a fix-it fast issue.
And additionally, the part of the fix-it is the restriction that comes after the binging. And, what was popping up in my head as Amy was saying that is that we are all taught that restriction is the fix for that binge. And that is so destructive, as we know.
One thing that comes up when I'm talking to my clients with binge eating disorder is that, especially if they're new to this idea, like some of them come in and they're like, I don't have an eating disorder. I just need to lose weight and I need to fix this body. And then as it, luckily, they have therapists. And so we're kind of working together and they realize like I have an eating disorder. One thing that's new to them is this idea that the binging is a coping tool for them. And you mentioned past trauma and, being in a larger body can be, in this society can be really difficult. And I think it's a coping tool in many ways around like shame and anger and loss. So can you sort of tell us about that? Why does binging become this coping tool?
Yeah, I think one of the earliest relationships that we have is with food. If you think about it, it's one of the first places that we get comfort. It's one of the first places we feel validated or we feel safe. It is an imperative. When we don't have enough of it, we do whatever we can to get it. So it's a very fundamental way of taking care of ourselves. So that's the first issue. But in addition, if we think about, particularly for kids, for many of my clients, their relationship with food has been complicated for much of their lives. And it was one of the first things that they went to soothe, or to treat themselves, or to just kind of disconnect. Lots of my clients talk about keeping food hidden in their rooms or in their lockers at school or whatever it might be, and just knowing it was there actually was calming for them, and particularly forbidden foods, things that maybe they weren't otherwise allowed to have. And so that relationship with food became a way to take good care of themselves, actually. And so over time, that relationship develops layer by layer by layer over the years. So it's something that a child has access to often, not always certainly, but often has access to. It's something they can control. It's something they can keep close. Most of there's that sort of narrative, again, that it's a willpower issue. But most of my clients who I see, if we think about what they've gotten through, it's extraordinary. The things that they have survived, the things that they've gone through, that they're not short on willpower by any stretch of the imagination. So food is a very very powerful way that they feel safe. One way I think about it, getting away from that, the willpower idea, is if you think about, most people talk about how they might start out the day with the very best of intentions to not binge. I'm going to be good, quote unquote. I'm going to stay on my diet. And then by the end of the day, they feel overwhelmed and they just have to go to the food. So if we think about what changed in the course of a day, and so often it is, there's a lot of social anxiety and fear and shame, big feelings that people really don't know what to do with. And so as a result, they go to that food to soothe. And the bottom line is that's going to be much more powerful than any diet.
Yeah. You know, I was interested in when I was reading the book and I saw that about 45% of binge eating disorder was it developed after restriction, but that, more than half also developed before restriction. I think I said that right. Yeah. And I was really interested in that statistic, because I always associate binge eating disorder as a result of restriction. It's just really interesting to hear that I think because food's so fundamental to our existence, right? That it's a wonderful comfort.
Right. And I think particularly if you're coming from a family system or a situation where there wasn't a lot of room for emotion, or perhaps there wasn't a lot of room for failure, perhaps expectations were very high. Those are some common things that I hear. Or perhaps there just wasn't a lot of a sense of safety, a kind of a rock or a landing place when you needed one. And so food can become all of those things. It's kind of the best option that kids may have available to them to cope.
I think it's so interesting because what I appreciate about your description there is that it is something that is in a child's ability to control. Like that's just one area where they can sort of exert some autonomy or also some agency in. And this is a question for each of you. In working with clients or each of your narratives, what is that sort of light bulb moment that helps people realize that food plays a useful coping tool? It might not be something that they want to do for the long term, right? But it's actually is on some level effective. Is there a moment where you sort of see that sort of light bulb come on for people?
I would say absolutely there is. Yeah. I think for one thing, when people come to realize that drive before they work on it, that drive to go to food feels essentially unstoppable. And I think when people realize that kind of compulsion, that kind of impulse to go to the food is coming from years and years of the food being effective, right? Of it working. When we go to food, particularly certain kinds of forbidden foods that people tend to binge on, people don't binge on carrots typically. They binge on foods that are forbidden, that they're not supposed to, quote unquote, eat. And what we see is that we have increased levels of dopamine, increased levels of serotonin when people go to those foods. In other words, going to food does work short term as a way to soothe anxiety. Now, that doesn't mean that, there's a lot of philosophy out there. Some folks feel like binging is an addiction. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's an addiction, kind of that dopamine addiction cycle. I don't see it that way. But I think what is true is that it does help to calm our anxiety. So the more people understand that the food has been a way for them to deal with something for which they have no other tools, the more they're able to meet that behavior with compassion instead of shame.
I agree from the perspective of, an individual with BED that light bulb really does go on when you realize that, everything starts to come together and what you've learned about binge eating disorder, and you're sitting there in the moment and your anxiety has topped out, and the only thing that your brain will allow you to think about is food. And for me, that connection when I could feel my anxiety rising. And as my anxiety was rising, so was my focus on food. And it still happens, but recovery looks different in terms of being able to turn that around. And once you actually have the food, it allows you to dissociate. You can temporarily leave that that anxiety and all of the feelings that went with it, and you're focused on the food. Sometimes you're not even feeling food going into your mouth, but there are sensations that are going on, and in recovery, you really learn to feel those sensations and understand, and that helps you get past binging. But when it's actually happening, all of those sensations are powerful and they're much more comforting than sitting with anxiety. So being able to dissociate and calm the anxiety is a really, really useful tool. And so it makes complete sense why food and binging on that food would be a wonderful tool for some folks.
I'm thinking about, clients that have talked about this in the past also, in adding these other stories, is how important it is for both the client, but also the clinician, to validate that experience instead of shaming it. Again, is thinking about from a dietitian perspective, we can do a lot of harm by invalidating or shaming that behavior. So there's a lot of work we need to do to make sure that we're holding space for those clients and not bringing more shame to what they might already be experiencing.
Absolutely.
So there's a quote from the book that I really liked. It's this: "It's due to such fears about safety and acceptance, many with BED describe a sense of acting in their lives, of rarely being themselves, even in the most mundane of situations." And that quote just landed really strongly for me. I was wondering if you could just expand on that thought a little bit, especially with regards to that safety and acceptance piece.
Sure, I certainly can from a clinical lens and also from a personal lens. And I think Chevese's story speaks so well to this too. There's so many examples of it in the book. I think about so often the narratives for people who are struggling with binge eating disorder, they're the narratives that they have learned due to many circumstances in their lives are basically things like, again, if I'm authentic, if I'm who I actually am, I'm not going to be smart enough. I'm not going to be capable enough. People aren't going to like me, that fundamentally I'm not going to have the connections that I need. So I need to perform. I need to do kind of what's expected, which means I need to try to be thin. That's how it plays out in terms of that, the weight stigma piece. But it goes much deeper than that too, typically. It's kind of a sense of, I have to always look like I know what I'm doing, or I have to be sure that nobody's angry with me, or I have to be sure that I'm mirroring the person that I'm with and in agreement with them. So there's a lot of sense of what we call an external locus of control. That is, how I get to feel about myself and my safety is outside of me. It's kind of up to the people around me. And that's extraordinarily stressful. You think about it, because as soon as you walk out the front door, right, your safety is in question. If someone likes you or doesn't like you or is okay with something you do or say or think. So there's a lot of adaptation to others for my clients. So sometimes the only time that they're truly authentic is when they're alone. And so that's a big piece of the work that they're carrying around with them. It's a lot of work to just be in the world. I have a client who, just as a quick example, actually this was just a couple of weeks ago, she was talking about standing in line at the drugstore, and it just sort of hit her how incredibly self-conscious she was about how she was being seen, what people were thinking about what was in her cart, just all kinds of thoughts about, what is that person thinking? What's that group of teenagers thinking? Just, basically, bottom line is just, this is not safe. She was just so aware and kind of realized, I do that all the time. That's my whole world from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. So that's what I mean. I think that addresses your question, Aaron, from my...
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think about like sort of the neurobiology of being under that constant stress all day and how much that affects us, not even just, and then the emotional part, right? So like the what we can see, but also what we can feel part. It's overwhelming for the whole day.
Absolutely. I often talk about it with my clients as like you're moving through the world in a state of yellow alert. So you kind of have this, your cortisol is up, adrenaline's up, just that sort of sense of, I have to be watching for danger. I have to be watching for judgment or rejection or whatever their story might be. But it is a tremendous amount of work.
And you're also preparing for it all the time. So it's not just when you're out in public and amongst other people, you're in your home alone and you're preparing for it. You're looking in the mirror constantly. You're thinking about what you're going to eat when you go out with a group of friends. You're thinking about what you're going to wear or say. It's a never-ending cycle of distress, and the only time that you have any relief from that is when you're binging.
Yeah, you're describing basically all of my clients right now. Exactly, and I think that they're going to be so probably surprised to hear, that they're not alone in this situation. That this is happening to other people, and this happens for a reason. Just what you've described about sort of being, needing to be alone and just the constant surveillance and being on yellow alert. It's so sort of just listening to the idea of that is very anxiety provoking. Imagine living in that. So thank you for sort of describing that for everybody, that is probably resonating. A lot of people are resonating with that right now, I'm sure.
The really good news on the other side of this is that we know so much more now about neurologically how that yellow alert activation happens. And so to that, because we know more about how it happens, we know more about how to get out of it. And so that's the good news, is we can begin to learn, even if our system is responding as though there are tigers in the vicinity, we can get really good at knowing whether or not there's actually a tiger, and we can back down from that anxiety response. So that's the very, very good news in terms of recovery.
Right. We're not unchangeable. Like we can sort of manage that once we sort of learn how and what works for us. So
yes, we can learn, which is the good news. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You use an acronym in the book, POWER, I assume is how we say it, but POWR. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what it stands for?
Sure. So POWER is it's a quick 4-step process that I like to use for clients, to offer clients when they're getting hijacked by those old narratives. So, for example, the client that I mentioned who was standing in line at the drugstore, we went on to talk about her walking through that experience using the POWER process. And basically, it's 4 pretty simple steps, although they're simple, but they are revolutionary for many of us, not just people with binge eating disorder. But so it's pause into presence. That's the P. The O is open and allow. The W is wisely consider, and the R is respond with care. And basically what that does is it allows us to slow down those strong narratives about, oh gosh, they're basically shame and fear-based narratives. I'm not good enough. I just said something stupid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh my gosh, I look terrible in this outfit. I look so fat today, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a way of slowing down our process enough so that we can recognize when those narratives are happening and begin to challenge them. They're so fast, typically for clients. They're just like a mantra that has been there always. And so even just the idea of pausing and noticing, wow, I'm getting really hijacked by fear and shame here. Let me open to that experience, see what's happening. Wisely consider what is really true here. And there are a lot of strategies that I use with clients to help them really consider, are there tigers? In other words, is there really danger here? Or am I reacting to something that's very old? And then responding with care allows us to meet the actual need. What is it I really need right now? Is it reassurance? Is it connection? It might be food, but it might be something else. So we create a lot of different ways to listen to what those real needs are. It's an acronym because I find that really helps when people are hijacked by that fear and shame energy. It's really helpful to have something concrete that you can do in that moment to step out of the experience. it also is those shame and fear narratives are probably the single biggest drivers of binge eating. So if we think about, being able to, when we feel that impulse to go to food, if we've got a process that allows us to slow down and check in, even if we ultimately go to the food, what I find is when people check in, actually they want less food, or they want food less often. And so it's a very validating, compassionate, quick process that people can do.
Right. And I love that it's about what you said is, even if you go to the food, it's okay, but you've stopped and checked in. And that's what I've said to my clients. Like, sometimes you go to the food and that's okay, but give yourself the space to think about what you need in the moment. And so I love that this is like the perfect acronym to give to people, and I will be using it constantly. So thank you.
Okay. I'm glad to.
Just make sure you give credit, right, when you use it in your sessions, because, we want to make I see a little C right next to this.
I wanted to tell everybody to read this book, but if they don't, I'm still going to use this and say, this isn't a great book.
There's no shame.
This isn't a great book that you need to read, but if you don't read it, we're going to use this anyway. So absolutely. Credit where credit is due.
So just again, to try to connect, what's in the room, but also the experiences. Chevese, like what? Were there things like this that were also important for you in your recovery to help you sort of be more attentive in the moment that might have helped you?
Yeah. I unfortunately had a very long history of some not so great interventions. It was when I finally found a therapist that even identified that I had an eating disorder. It still was many years after that I was able to do some work where I really understood what Amy is talking about. And so I think about the 30, 40 years that I spent just kind of flailing around out there and not having any clue about what was actually going on. But when I did, it really became about it. It started for me with some mindfulness type of techniques, but really just being able to connect that, I am in this state of anxiety and, I have the option for food, and it took a lot of just sitting and saying, okay, I am going to go for the food. I'm going to just go there and being okay with that. I think that was one of the very first most important steps, that I could go for the food and be okay with that and not have it turn into a cycle of restriction, which then led back to more binging because I was anxious about the initial binge and then the restriction, and it just it really is a cycle of anxiety that happens. Learning to use some mindfulness techniques and being able to be okay with going to the food, and then eventually being curious about what it would feel like not to go to the food. And to be totally honest, there were some times when not going to food made me more anxious. And so it was really a journey of just trying over and over again and figuring out what was going to work. And what that taught me is each time this happened for me, it was probably going to be a little different in how I responded, how high the anxiety was, what the situation was. But over time, I would become more and more adept at being able to self-care, pursue self-care in ways that maybe weren't food, or it delayed the food option for a while. And I, checked in with myself and saw, okay, well, maybe I'm actually hungry now, and maybe it's I'm ready to eat, and it's not about the anxiety. So I think it's so important for people to understand that. I've read I've read other books about not just binge eating disorder, but anything under the sun that someone is trying to cope with themselves. And there's always, if you just follow 1 through 6, then you will never have this problem again. And that's not reality. That's not how it's going to work. But Amy is teaching her clients. What I had to learn is that this is a way to slow things down and to begin to understand it. And it's not going to be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's going to take some time. Each person's going to have their own journey. And but this is a tool to help you. And each time you'll use it the best that you can, the best way that it works for you. And you'll see what comes, and you get better and better at dealing with it. So that's a true learning experience, and a true, if you want to call it a skill, but it is being able to cope with the differences of the experience and move on.
I think that's such a valuable piece, to acknowledge that each time is going to be different. I think a lot of people, again, the fix it mentality is that we want, 1 through 6 to work every time, and we get so upset at ourselves when it doesn't work every time. So I really appreciate that perspective of acknowledging that each experience is different. The other thing that you just said, Chevese, I think is that we need to just remind our listeners and bring some context is, you're writing this book and it's 2018, and people have been struggling with this eating disorder for decades. I think why this book is so important is, we know so much more now, and to think about the people that, like yourself, Chevese, and many others who probably went to treatment that was so uninformed, I guess, because the knowledge base wasn't there, the diet mentality was there. It's been a long journey for a lot of people. So I appreciate you sharing that part of it, because I think it adds an important context, and especially, again, it adds some gravity to why this book is so important, and hearing the stories are so important.
Yes, and if I may, I'd like to add that there is still a lot of really bad treatment out there.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even call it treatment, and it actually upsets me quite a bit to see that there are there are studies and there are treatments out there that I experienced 20, 30 years ago, and they're still being studied and they're still being touted. And it's really important for your listeners to know that, many of us have already been through the diet paradigm and what it means when you have an eating disorder, what it means for your disorder when you are continually going through weight management programs and diet programs as a way to address your eating disorder. It is each time really it just serves to entrench the eating disorder. And, there are people out there who are well-meaning, but they don't have the experience, they don't have the understanding, and they themselves are still very much in a paradigm that tells them that any body that is not within certain confines of size is a wrong body, and that is it's not right, and it's very dangerous. So this is difficult, what we're talking about. This is not an easy shift to think about this in a way that it does not involve pursuing weight loss or pursuing a different body type. And there are still lots of companies and medical practices and frankly, people who are considered thought leaders in the area of eating disorders who continue to tout this, weight loss as a necessary pursuit for people in larger bodies who have eating disorders. And those of us who have been down this road know the harm that does. And I look forward to the day when we no longer have to go up against these types of interventions.
Yeah, that enrages me too, that this is still being treated with weight loss by, a lot of treatment programs out there.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that my clients sort of, as they're starting to go through recovery and they're actually seeing relief, they still are, there's a big part of them that says, I still want to lose weight though, and I still want to change my body. And I'm wondering, Chevese, if you could share what was useful for you if that was a problem for you, first of all, and if you had a moment where you turned a corner on that. And Amy, if you can share what has worked for your clients, just a little bit about like what has been helpful in turning that corner of like, what, maybe that has not worked and maybe I need to try this new thing and work towards body acceptance.
Oh, another long road. Yeah, yes.
I know. And another hour, go. And not to
we ask
put
only
too
the
much
easy
pressure on, but
here.
just something about what was really useful for you.
I was one of those people that was, when I met the first person that told me that, maybe I should consider that I might be in this body for the rest of my life. Oh my God. Numerous therapy appointments after that to just be able to deal with that thought. That just, it wasn't an option. And, when I started Beta, I had one foot in each paradigm. I so wanted still to lose weight, it wasn't for me just any one thing, that it was all of a sudden there was this moment where I had a shift. It really was a combination of reading studies that showed that, because of human biology, it really is difficult to lose weight and keep it off, and that the body will do anything to regain that weight. It was, looking honestly at my own journey at that point and seeing that, the same thing, what I was doing over and over and over again was continuing to fail. And why should I continue to pursue these things that just are going to continue to fail? It makes me feel like a failure. It was listening to people who had a long journey and who had themselves found health at every size and the fat acceptance movement, and really being able to understand why they had come to a point in their lives where they knew that the pursuit of weight loss was no longer working for them and really had not been working for them. And it was looking at my own health situation and realizing that probably a lot of my dieting and regain and so forth had done some pretty negative things to my body, and I didn't want to continue to inflict that harm. There were still realities in front of me, and there still are today, of, metabolic issues. I have polycystic ovary syndrome as well, and some other things going on that I knew that health was really important to me, but I was beginning to learn that I had to disconnect the weight part from the health part if I was going to be able to move beyond my eating disorder and actually pay attention to the health piece. And that's an ongoing thing for me. I'm turning 50 this year. Unfortunately, with each year and each decade comes new wonderful things with our bodies that we don't always particularly like. And so I find that it's ongoing. I'll be completely honest and say that there are days when I still want to lose weight. And I am firmly in the health at every size belief that pursuit of weight loss will only serve to be a detriment for me, my body, and my health. And yet those thoughts are still there at times. And much like working through the binge, I have to work through that. And I have to focus on the ways that I can take care of myself and pursue health that's best for me.
I so appreciate that. That's, you can share that piece, that even someone who's so entrenched and within our Haze community can also have that sort of wake up one day and say, oh, but I sort of want to lose weight. And how do we reconcile that and sit with that feeling? I really appreciate that, because I know a lot of our listeners are probably feeling the same way at sometimes also.
I think one of the things, and Chevese speaks to this, of course, so eloquently, I think one of the things that's really true here is it is incredibly seductive to think that there's an answer, right? That if we do this thing, that is lose weight, we'll be acceptable, we'll be lovable, we'll have the life that we want. There's so many things that we attach to being in a certain body size. And it's an incredibly seductive story, particularly if you haven't felt okay about who you are all along, right? There's a fix, there's a way to make it okay. So letting go of that narrative psychologically is extremely difficult to do. But what's on the other side of it is real recovery, I think. And again, it's not a black and white issue, certainly. But I think what happens as we begin to increasingly let go of that narrative is we come to see that we're not broken, that there really isn't something that needs to be fixed. There are things that need to be tended and loved and noticed, but not fixed. So I think that piece really challenges those shame narratives and the fear narratives that are so present in trauma. So body acceptance is really integral to healing binge eating disorder. It's key.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe this is a good thing to sort of then, because I think we're sort of touching on this in many different ways, but I think you mentioned in the book about making your body a home versus a billboard. And it's a really great analogy. And just, give us some thoughts on, or expand a little bit about that process and why it's so important for us.
That just felt that phrase about our bodies, our home versus a billboard. I don't just kind of, it actually just came to me. I thought that so summarizes my experience. My body growing up, and I think for many of my clients, was a billboard. It was, how does it look? Not what is it experiencing? Right? That was not the most important thing about it. Certainly I was taught that I couldn't trust it, that it wasn't something that I could listen to its cues of hunger and fullness, or the need to move, or the need to rest, and expect to be successful, expect to be okay in the world. So I think that was one thing, is it spoke to, the billboard idea speaks to our body is a representation of our worth and value, and that worth and value is conditional on a very particular set of attributes that we're supposed to have, as opposed to our body being the place where we spend our lives. It's the thing that 24/7 is doing its very best to carry us around and get us through a whole host of experiences. So I think that the more we're able to think about our body as our home, the more we move toward compassion for it and for its experiences. And I agree with Chevese on this one, that does, as we age, I think that becomes an even more important thing to be able to do. To know that, if we see the signs of aging, for example, in our bodies, it's because of what they've been through, not because they're not, holding up anymore. I think it becomes really important to shift that narrative. There's a lot of money in shame around our bodies. There's a lot of money to be made if we're going around thinking about our bodies as a billboard. So there's a lot of encouragement to think about how we look and not how we feel. So again, taking that locus of control back from outside and putting it into our bodies experience more, I think is extremely healing.
I love that.
Yeah, I love it too. Chevese, anything you want to add to that, or just to give you a chance to respond to that one?
I don't think I can sum any better.
Okay. Mic drop moment, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I just want to say I've already used that with a client that, it's so clear, right? That your body is your home, and it doesn't need to be a billboard. And I think when people hear it, they get it right away. And it's a new concept to them too.
Mm-hmm. It is.
Well, I want to thank each of you for, again, taking the time to come on. And, I sort of feel like we touched the surface on a lot of things. We didn't even get to so much of the weight stigma piece and other things that I know are so important in this work. But I just want to, again, personally thank you for coming on and sharing so much. And also want to thank you for writing this book. I think it's going to be helpful for a lot of people. And I think it's really valuable to our community. And so where can people buy this book? I know they're going to listen to this podcast and they're going to be like itching to actually get this book. So what's the best way to get this book into people's hands?
Amazon.com actually is probably the easiest and the fastest way to get it.
So we'll put a link to that in our show notes. Any other things that you all want to, where can we learn more about some of your work, or where can we follow you? Any plugs you want to give us?
Yes, our website for the book is www.bedrecovery.com, and we are doing a bit of a book tour coming up. We'll be on the West Coast, and we'll continue to put dates on that website. We will have blog posts and so forth, so definitely keep up with us there. I can be found currently through the National Eating Disorders Association, and that's nationaleatingdisordersorg.com. And Amy, do you want to give your information?
Probably the easiest way to get in touch with me if people have questions or just anything that they any way that I can be of help, through the book website or also through thebodywiseprogram.com.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely put links to all that in our show notes so people can check that out. I'm on the website now. It looks great. So we will definitely include all that information. Well, thank you again for coming on, and this has been a really amazing episode. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It was a delight to speak to you.